Hi everyone, and welcome to this podcast recorded and produced by the Royal College of Occupational Therapists. This is one of a series of podcasts which really focus on hearing and sharing the career narratives of our diverse workforce and highlight a whole range of possibilities in occupational therapy. My name's Hannah Spencer, and I'm an occupational therapist that's had the absolute pleasure and privilege of facilitating and capturing these conversations with members of our occupational therapy community.
Booth-Gardiner. I am a lead occupational therapist in acute and rehab services in a mental health trust in the northeast of England. I'm also a bit of an OT geek, so I do quite a lot of voluntary stuff. So I'm the current treasurer for the Royal College of OT's Northern and Yorkshire Regional Committee. I am a member of OTalk, which is a Twitter chat about occupational therapy that happens every week. So I'm one of the kind of organising committee behind that. And I'm also a founding member of AbleOTUK, which is a support network for occupational therapists with lived experience of disabilities and or long-term health conditions.
Well, you've got plenty of hats to bring to the mix today.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. So I guess the purpose of today's conversation is about kind of your career journey. So thinking right at the beginning of that, what drew you to occupational therapy?
So I am a second generation occupational therapist. So my mother trained she was late to occupational therapy. She was in her 30s when she trained. I grew up with her being an occupational therapist. So it was always kind of in the background. And I was also born with a disability. So I have cerebral palsy, which cerebral palsy is a kind of umbrella term. Mm-hmm. So my diagnosis is a right hemiplegia, so it impacts the right side of my body, which actually means that the brain damage is on the left-hand side because the left-hand side controls the right-hand side of the body. So it's mainly weakness on the right side. Some stuff get kind of spasms and have difficulty kind of controlling my right foot. And don't really have much sensation or feeling about where the foot is in space sometimes. And I'm also dyslexic. So kind of grew up with mum being quite proactive about ensuring that I experienced life. I remember she tells me this story about the first time that I ever walked to the local shop to get some milk, which was on our street. And she suddenly got phone calls from all of the neighbours going, "Oh, do you know Rachel's out by herself?" And she's like, "Yes," because she has to learn this skill. Mm-hmm. And my mum always worked with children with mainly learning disabilities. And I remember I always get to go to the Christmas party and was always kind of encouraged to not be limited. And then when I was at school, I guess you kind of go through those processes of what you want to do, what you don't want to do. And I remember you do that, like, what do you call them?
Like the career quiz type thing.
Yes, career quiz, that's the one. Mm-hmm. And I think I'd said stuff about kind of wanting to work with children or something. And it came out, that a nursery nurse would be a good role for me. Mm-hmm. But it had this, because I'd declared a disability, it had this caveat that, but we would have to discuss whether you'd physically be able to do that. And I remember that was probably one of the first times that I was a bit like, oh. And then I also remember a doctor saying to me, probably when I was about 14, that it wasn't usual to be in pain because I'd always had stiffness and pain. Mm-hmm. Like I just didn't understand that wasn't something that wasn't part of everybody's life. So kind of those kind of things coupled together, that's when you begin to see that, that there's a little bit of a difference. And also at school, primary school, the day that everybody got their letters to say that we were going to secondary school, everyone mm-hmm. else just got a normal one-page letter saying blah, and I got this envelope and I took it home. And then I remember it was in the days before mobile phones, I was in the car with mum and she like stopped the car on the side of the road and went to a payphone to speak to somebody. And it was again this idea that they'd seen cerebral palsy written down on a piece of paper and made assumptions around what my capabilities would be. So that's when I began to understand that mum needed to fight on my behalf behind my back for things that other children didn't need to. Always kind of grew up with that within the family home of being really supported to be the person that I wanted to be, but outside of the family home, always having to have a fight to be the person that I wanted to be, if that makes sense. So that sat with me. And then I did A-levels, struggled a little bit with A-levels. Then I went and did a GMVQ in health and social care. And when you do that, you have kind of like placement. So I think I decided that I wanted to be a social worker. So I had a placement with a social worker. My next placement that I had to do, mum was like, well, do you want me to, she was an occupational therapist, do you want me to find one that you can do with an OT? I was like, yeah, okay. And then I remember like the second day, I was like, oh God, this is a nightmare because this is what I want to do. Because this is really good. And it was working with an OT in a community mental health setting. And it was just kind of just engaging with people and talking with people and finding out who they were and what they wanted, and this idea that society and the world put all these barriers in place all of the time, and I wanted to help with that because of my own personal experiences, I think. So then I started to apply to university and got quite scared because I'm not academic and I really struggle academically. So I then applied for some OT assistant jobs and I got one, and did that for about 2 years and then reapplied. And then because I was in a secure job, the trust that I worked for seconded nurses to go and do their training, but they didn't second anybody else. So I asked questions around that from a fairness point of view, and was told, oh, actually, yes, we should do it for all of our assistants across the board. So I was the first OT assistant in the trust that I worked for to be seconded by the trust to go and train as an OT. So I went and did that at Teesside. So I think I was about 22, 21, 22. So a little bit older than some of the people there. But I would say that actually there was an equal amount of kind of graduates come straight from school and an older population. And because of the university is in quite a large town in the northeast of England, lots of local people, particularly your maturer students, were local people, and quite a big Irish intake because we're quite near a airport that comes in from Ireland. So it was a really good mix. But I had issues with placements. Again, this idea of you write a letter and I would disclose my disabilities. And for me, actually, the dyslexia was more of an issue than the cerebral palsy. Hello, my cat has come to join. But I got my first placement, I got a letter back saying that they didn't think they could take me. So kind of had to go in with the university and kind of unpick some of these thoughts around what I could and couldn't manage to do, and begin to think about what reasonable adjustments were. And I found uni really hard, and I found placements really hard, because suddenly I was having to, you have to be open to an extent, so that people know how to interact, and things like surroundings and environment needs to be a little bit different. But when it feels like you're always starting off on a negative foot, because people have to make adjustments and have to change, and that's hard for someone to process. And I didn't really enjoy most of my placements. I did mental health, I did trauma and orthopedics. My last one was spinal injuries, which I loved. And the spinal injuries one was really, really interesting, and I loved kind of that interaction and that ability to kind of go, I struggle. And often I'm working with people at the point where they've just become disabled. And that is a really difficult process to go through. So then when I qualified, because I was seconded by the trust, I was got a job back in the trust, which was a mental health trust, which is still technically the trust that I work for, although it's been through some organisational changes. It's got much bigger and it's changed its name twice, I think, in that time. So so worked in first of all acute psychiatry as a band 5, then I moved over to forensics as a band 5. Loved both of those. Found ways and means to work around kind of my disability, felt comfortable with it, always used it positively and appropriately with clients. I can recall things like encouraging someone to come out for a walk and them going, oh, you know, well, it's quite painful and quite difficult and I'm afraid. And then I would sit and kind of go, you know, well, I find it quite painful. And, you know, that kind of motivated her to think about doing it together. And the term she used, well, if you can do it, then I can do it. And they're just things, but always appropriately and always mindful that my disclosure was appropriate at times. So did that, then got a band 6 job back in acute services. The trust looked at a big pilot project around kind of waste and better use of time, and I was quite heavily involved in that. And from that, I think I did the band 6 job for probably about 6 years, and then there was an opportunity to become a clinical lead in acute services, so applied and got that job, so working within the same team. And that role changed over time as services and structures changed. It got bigger, so it started with just acute psychiatry, then it got added on to have the rehab services included in it. I'd never worked in rehab before, so that was a big learning curve. Then did that for a couple of years. Then I so at a kind of band 7 level, and then you kind of get a little bit stuck in the NHS, particularly if you want to stay clinical, and certainly within our trust, if you want to kind of progress pay-wise, then it takes you away from kind of that pure service delivery. So I'd done acute and rehab services for such a long time, and I was slightly worried that my skill set, you know, was good, but only in the setting that I was in, particularly when it came to was always mindful that if I had a service user in mental health services that had a physical issue, that I wanted to be able to deal with it. Didn't want to have to refer to an occupational therapist in the physical hospital to order some equipment or to teach someone how to use a hoist. So there were always skills that I wanted to keep up. And it does come up normally on a Friday afternoon. So yeah, mindful that I kind of wanted to keep those skills going, but kind of at this plethora that I'd done that role for probably about 4 or 5 years, felt like it was going well, and that things were kind of steadily going along. Wanted to challenge myself a little bit more, so was beginning to look for other things. So then I took a sidestep as a clinical lead for forensic services. So I'd done that as a band 5, kind of going into really restricted areas. So my caseload in acute psychiatry was always the intensive care unit. So the the psychiatric intensive care unit, or PICU as they call it. And that was always working in a slightly more restricted environment and often challenging that restricted environment. So going into secure services, I knew would be a challenge, but it was at a time where the CQC had come in and said, you're too restrictive, and they talk about this blanket restrictions. So, and secure services are very good at having blanket restrictions. So it's like no to everything, rather than actually what are your risks and how do we balance that? And that is difficult to do. So found it really challenging, enjoying it, but then at that point COVID happened, and unfortunately for me, that meant becoming really unwell, and going into hospital. So to cut a very, very long story short, I spent just over a year of my life in 2 physical hospitals. I was moved around. Then I was at home for about a year and 4 months. COVID had really impacted on my entire body. I spent quite a lot of time in ITU. So my whole body had deconditioned, and because of existing disabilities, it took much longer for my body to recover from it. Because my whole body had deconditioned, I was unable to walk and move. So I sat on a medical ward in a hospital up in Newcastle for about 4 months while they debated which rehab unit would take me, because I don't meet the criteria for a neuro rehab ward because I didn't have a brain injury. Technically, cerebral palsy is a brain injury, but we will go aside from that. So I had some wonderful OTs that kind of did their best to work with me in that time, and physios that did their best with the resources that they had, but I wasn't in the right place. And it was the system that really stopped you from doing that. And at that time, it was the first time that I got to share a space with other patients and hearing what they thought about the delivery of OT was really, really eye-opening. So that really, really made me reflect. And I was actually discharged home, still being hoisted, felt a little bit kind of forgotten about by services, or let down by services, which I know has gone off on a tangent a little bit, and then it kind of comes down to lots of stuff around feelings of what others' expectations of my recovery would be compared to my expectations, within the family as well. And I remember having conversations, particularly with my dad, around, being able to walk again. And I can walk, but I was always in pain when I walked. And now I can walk up the stairs at home with the 2 handrails if I'm wearing my shoes. If I'm not wearing shoes the way that my foot goes, it's really difficult to walk. I can wander around the house kind of holding on to walls or using my sticks. But to go to the shops is really painful. If I walked, so I choose to use an electric wheelchair because I'm not in pain, and it saves my energy for things that I want to do. And that's a process that I really, really internally think about, and that kind of judgment around what our expectations of our patients are in terms of the occupations that they need to, want to, and are required to do.
And the ditching the assumptions and really listening and really getting to know that person and what's meaningful for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then kind of when it comes to wheelchair services, because I can walk, I don't meet criteria for a chair that actually means that I can do the occupations that I want to do, like having enough energy to get to work. Because my brain, although the COVID, kind of there's still brain fog there, it's quite a good brain. It works fairly well. It's just the legs that aren't brilliant. And I want to save all my energy and thought processing and kind of for things that I want to really, that I enjoy and that I get fulfillment from. But equally, I understand that reducing what I do physically will also have impact on my life. So I've joined the gym, I'll go with my husband. I get some funny looks going in the wheelchair and then suddenly using all of the equipment, and it's that kind of process, isn't it, about what we think a wheelchair user can and can't do. And I struggle with it sometimes. So I've returned to work in October last year, so about 2.5 years off, back into my existing role as lead therapist in acute and rehab services, which was what I was doing before I went to forensics, because the forensics post was a secondment. It's only been 3 months, but challenging. But I've come back as a very different therapist who questions why we are making some of the assumption decisions that we would often always make. And I'm finding in the supervision that I'm doing with staff, because that is kind of my main role, is that I'm really questioning some of the thinking in the choices of interventions that they're doing.
And it's brilliant. You can really hear in how you talk that how much your own experiences as a person are completely intertwined with the therapist that you are, and that kind of, if we think about your career as a river and think about the things that have contributed to that flow, there's so many personal experiences, and like right from the very beginning, from your mom being an OT, and from that almost nurtured right from the beginning advocacy within you. You
Absolutely.
can see that how that's contributed to you as a therapist.
Absolutely. And I would say kind of, so in the clinical lead roles, it's always been a line management role as well. And I've taken that in, and I've got staff, so I've got, and it's quite, and I always wonder about the statistic around dyslexia and OTs, because in my experience there's quite a high percentage of students and therapists that come through who have dyslexia, and I do wonder whether it's this kind of creative thinking that perhaps brings those of us with dyslexia to the profession. But very mindful around when I've got students and when I've got staff, around making sure that I'm making those reasonable adjustments for people and changing the environment.
So we've talked a bit about how the environment's enabled and restricted your career journey, and we've talked about some of the boulders along the way. What do you think's helped for you?
Definitely some mentors in my life. And I would have to describe my mum as one of those. Some other colleagues that I've kind of worked with, often, if I'm honest, those colleagues that have struggled with disability, and how the profession and the workplace has managed that, both in my trust and equally kind of use. I remember back in the day when the RCOT website used to have these chat rooms on. I think I was actually a student when they had these chat rooms. It was like a big time for chat rooms. And there was a chat room for OTs with lived experience, although we didn't call it that at that point. I think we called it the Disabled Persons Forum, but began to meet other occupational therapists with lived experience and really found a home there. And then I think that's where I found Twitter, and then began to kind of find communities within the profession that I could have those thoughts and discussions, and then came across OTalk in quite its early days and was probably someone that was there every week because I suddenly found people that I could kind of have those philosophical conversations with, or kind of check out, this is what I'm thinking, without that kind of, without the red tape of procedure and structure which there was at work. And And then I'd actually fallen down the stairs and broken my leg, and I was in hospital for 16 days, which I thought was like, and it was over Christmas, which I thought was horrendous, but little did I know that
What was coming?
yeah, absolutely. And the team behind OTalk were taking a bit of a break because they were writing some, I think it was something for BJOT. So they'd asked some of us that engaged quite regularly to kind of take over looking after the chats, which I really, really enjoyed. We did it for a little while, and then I was asked to join the team kind of full time. So by that time, my mum was the head of allied health professions in the trust that I worked for. So she would kind of have lots of networks, and she would go to conference every year. So I'm extremely privileged in that I would either go with her or take some time off work and go with her. I was always very conscious that I didn't want it to be seen as
your mum's daughter kind of thing. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So it was always but began to network with people within kind of RCOT organisations, but equally began to network with people on Twitter and other things. And then as OTalk kind of developed, we would kind of find ways to get ourselves to conference, either self-funding or going to our regional committees and kind of getting funding. So and it was a way for us to kind of meet each other in real life as well, and spend some time together. And we did that probably for about 3 or 4 years, and then we began to put in abstracts to present at conference and things, and really built this friendship group with a bunch of people that I met online, but we all had that really similar passion for discussing occupational therapy and for CPD, I think, as well. So yeah, and kind of then that grew into developing AbleOTUK UK, which again came through connections with people online. And I do have some connections at work, but I would say that the majority of my kind of the inspirational things, the things that really get me to think about, are those communities that I've met online and those communities that I've met through engaging in RCOT events.
Connection, community, peer support in terms of people that have had shared experiences or experiences that may be similar, that you know, there's connection there. And that's almost the stuff that's really hard to define, isn't it? You know, you say what helped. Well, actually, just some of the being helped, and the being together in spaces helped.
And I've from being a band 6, so I'm quite an active member within the Royal College of OT, and I always believe that actually you get out of the Royal College what you put into it. I criticise them occasionally, but I also praise them, and I found that being on regional committees really helped with that networking as well. So I think my first time I was on a regional committee, I was the membership lead. Second time I was chair. I've gone back now as treasurer. And that's kind of building those local links as well. So you're knowing who works in the trust next door to you, because actually
useful.
Yeah. So
I think I can almost hear an answer before I ask the question, but what do you wish you'd known as an early career OT or prior to joining the profession? Or what would you say now to your early career self?
I think one of the things I would say is, don't be afraid to ask questions when you don't know the answer. I was very afraid when I first qualified, in feeling that I had to know everything, and wouldn't ask questions, and would then kind of go away and spend ages trying to work something out. And actually now I'm just like, just talk me through your thoughts. So I think slightly gone off on a tangent there, but absolutely that
asking questions
and
not being afraid. And the answer that I thought you were going to give was just connect. Yeah,
absolutely. Build those connections. And if you from a career point of view, you know, yes, if you work in one organisation, that's good, but the world is much bigger than that organisation. And that realisation that connecting with people outside of that organisation really helps your career and your thought processes and making you a better therapist.
What's next for you?
I've got some thoughts around wanting to begin to use my experiences positively to make a conscious change to the profession. So there's a number of ways that I'm doing that. So I'm volunteering with RCOT on a number of projects. I have my, I think at this stage in my career, I've realised that if I want to make changes, I need to be in a position of influence. So I'm taking up any opportunity that allows me to kind of share my experience, but also listen to other people's experiences and learn from them. And I think that's really important, that quite a lot of the stuff that I think has really helped with my career development has been done voluntary in my own time. At work, I'm beginning to think about kind of new roles. So there's a couple of roles that would take me away from clinically working with patients, but may kind of help me influence how services are developed better. So I'm thinking that that is where I'm heading next.
Is there anything else that you'd add to the conversation we've had today?
I think so, Hannah. Be nice to kind of reflect on it. Advice that I'd give to others is kind of be open to opportunities and like say yes. Sometimes you take on too much and that's fine, and sometimes you have to go, actually, I've not got capacity right now. But when you say yes, it takes you in all sorts of weird and wonderful directions that you might never have imagined. So
totally, it's how the doors open, isn't it? Just saying yes.
Yeah.
And finally, I guess a quick fire finish the sentence type question just to finish with. So if you finish my sentence, being an occupational therapist is?
Being an occupational therapist is wonderful.